Peggy Guggenheim's Impact on Art Education by Sarah Bartlett. Art Addict was Peggy Guggenheim's self-proclaimed title. Her career certainly revolved around her passion for collecting and sharing art. Because of Peggy's work to collect art and support modern artists, from 1938 to 1979, it paved the way for art education in the United States to be greatly impacted by modern art. Peggy was born into a wealthy family in 1898, and her inheritance was what made her lifestyle and art collection possible. Both of Peggy's grandfathers, Meyer Guggenheim and James Seligman, were Jews who moved from Europe to America to find more freedom than they had experienced in Europe. Many different business ventures led them to become wealthy. Peggy's parents were Benjamin and Florette Guggenheim. She had an older sister, Benita, whom she adored, and a younger sister, Hazel. Unfortunately, she doesn't share any golden memories with her sisters from childhood. In her autobiography, she recalls often feeling lonely as a child. As a girl, Peggy was introduced to the art world through her private education and the appreciation her father had for art. Peggy explains in her autobiography, "My father insisted that his children be well educated and saw to it that we acquired good taste. He himself was keen on art and bought a lot of paintings." From a young age, Peggy was already being exposed to art appreciated by elite Americans and Europeans. In fact, though her family was based in New York, they often traveled to Europe to visit relatives. She tells the story of one of her trips to Europe as a child. "My father engaged a lady named Mrs. Hartman to teach us art. We brought her to Europe with us, and it was her duty to make us cultured. I am sure Mrs. Hartman did her best to stimulate our imaginations, but personally, at that time, I was more interested in other things." After childhood, Peggy's life became full of romantic passion. She was first married to Lawrence Vale. Peggy says, "Lawrence was considered the king of Bohemia. He knew all the American writers and painters, and a lot of French ones too." Her life with Lawrence was thrilling. She was able to meet many of the artists that he was connected to. For most of their time together, they lived in France. They had 2 children together, Pegine and Sinbad. However, their marriage was wrought with many fights and ended in divorce. After Lawrence, Peggy had a relationship with a man named John Holmes, and Peggy describes him fondly. She says, "In 5 years, he taught me what life was all about." Most of her time with John was spent in France and England, though they traveled around Europe as often as well. Unfortunately, her relationship with him ended in his death, and she mourned deeply for him. Many other relationships followed. Her only other marriage was with Max Ernst, a German surrealist painter. Guggenheim Jeune was the name of Peggy's gallery that she opened in London in 1937. As explained by Anton Gill in Peggy's biography, busy as he was at the end of 1937, Duchamp not only introduced Peggy to the artists he knew in Paris, but also taught her the fundamentals of understanding modern art. Duchamp is to thank for Peggy's understanding of abstract art and surrealism. She was only able to keep Guggenheim Jeune open until 1939 and ended up losing money from her business in art trading. Her work as an art dealer during this time wasn't profitable monetarily, but it built her interest in establishing a modern art museum. It was 1939 when she began to pursue her idea of founding a museum. She imagined a new modern art museum in London, taking inspiration from the Modern Art Museum in New York. Peggy approached Herbert Reed, an important British art critic, about helping her with this venture. He agreed to a 5-year contract as director. While working on establishing this museum, Gill says, "Peggy knew that she could draw not only on the academic and highly regarded Reed, but possibly on Penrose and certainly on Duchamp as well." These important art critics of the time were Peggy's friends, and she often sought the advice of these and others when making decisions about what modern art to pursue. Though much work was put into the plans for this museum, the war was upon them, and Peggy decided to postpone the project. but it was never picked up again after the war. Reed was released from his contract, but that did not end their friendship, and he did not lose sight of Peggy's dream. Gill says, "The legacy of Peggy's aborted plan, however, was the Institute of Contemporary Art, the major academy founded by Reed and Penrose in London nearly 10 years later." In 1941, Peggy traveled from Europe to New York with many contemporary European paintings and her sculptures that she had collected. Her actions rescued valuable modern art pieces from the threat of destruction in the war and allowed them to be experienced by Americans. New York was not only a safe haven for Peggy's collection, but many European artists themselves fled the war and landed in New York. This contributed to the rise of the New York art world. The community of artists and intellectuals that once gave Paris intellectual supremacy was scattered by the war, never quite to regain its position of influence. A new community of artists converged upon New York, including Piet Mondrian, Max Ernst, Arshile Gorky, Willem de Kooning, Marcel Duchamp, and Hans Hofmann. Though these artists differed in their styles, they began to influence younger Americans, such as Jackson Pollock and Clifford Still. What emerged was a New York school of painting. At the same time, New York became the international gathering place for art critics and dealers at the center of the art press. That was a quote from Efland. Peggy's presence in the New York art world certainly contributed to this convergence of artists and the creation of the New York Art School. Howard Putzel was another art critic that had a big impact on Peggy's taste. Peggy describes Putzel in her autobiography. "He had a brilliant eye for modern work, he was completely passionate about promoting it, and he had a sense of what would be appreciated long before it actually was." Putzel encouraged Peggy to purchase art that she otherwise might not have been interested in. He also introduced her to Max Ernst, an artist whose work Peggy collected and who also would become her husband. Peggy opened her next gallery, Art of the Century, in December of 1942 in New York City. Her idea was that it would serve as a museum space, but also be a place for patrons to purchase the art. And for that purpose, this gallery was a success. It was open for just 5 years, but Cottrell explains in her dissertation, "During that short but crucial period, Guggenheim mounted 43 exhibitions which showcased both singular examples of European modernism and the now recognized masterpieces of America's first vanguard movement." The space Peggy's gallery held for both European and American modern art allowed for this vanguard movement that can now be described as the New York School. Both her gallery and her home were spaces where American and European artists met and shared ideas. The Art of the Century Gallery hosted exhibitions for many modern artists. On the side of this slide, you can see a list of several artists that were shown in this gallery. Art of the Century made bold moves to expand the art world, including the way that women artists were viewed. In his biography of Peggy's life, Anton Gill describes the exhibition in 1943 that featured the work of 31 female artists. This was the first all-woman show in the United States, and credit for it is hard to place. Duchamp had probably suggested it to Peggy at some point earlier in their association, and Buffy Johnson mentions that she talked about it to Putzel, whom she'd gotten to know on the West Coast and in Paris. Whoever was responsible, the exhibition gained Peggy considerable cachet and was of great significance for women artists. Many excellent female painters and sculptors were active at the time, but the art world was dominated by men, and men commanded the lion's share of attention. Apparently, Peggy had never claimed to be a feminist during her lifetime, but her choice to honor women in her gallery definitely had an impact on the acknowledgement of women artists as equal to men. It wasn't an immediate change, but Peggy's actions paved the way for many women to have careers as artists in the future. Peggy's work had an incredible impact on the art world that often goes unnoticed. The role of art collector was key in the value that was placed on modern art. In her paper, Camille Cottrell explains that collectors were the ones to establish the market value as well as the aesthetic value of modern art. Patron support also allowed artists to actually continue to work and experiment during a difficult economic period. Being a patron of the arts was expensive, but Peggy was in a position of wealth and she chose to use her position to support artists. One artist that had a huge breakthrough thanks to the support of Peggy Guggenheim was Jackson Pollock. Thanks to the monthly stipend offered by Peggy, Pollock was able to work on developing his career as an artist. In 1943, Peggy commissioned a large-scale painting from Pollock to display in her home. This 20 by 8-foot painting was called Mural, and it was a turning point for Pollock's career. Peggy not only gave Jackson Pollock a huge start, she continued to support his work through his career. She brought his work to Europe with her after she had closed her gallery in New York. She describes sharing his paintings in Venice in 1950 in her autobiography with great fondness. She says, "Thousands of people saw this exhibition as it was in a room through which one had to pass in order to get to the Cora Museum. It was always lit at night, and I remember the extreme joy I had sitting in the Piazza San Marco, beholding the Pollocks glowing through the open windows of the museum, and then going out on the balcony of the gallery to see San Marco in front of me, knowing that the Pollocks were behind me. It seemed to place Pollock historically where he belonged as one of the greatest painters of our time, who had every right to be exhibited in this wonderful setting. All the young painters were very much influenced by this show." And indeed, Peggy's support of Pollock really did place him as one of the greatest painters of the modern era. He is still highly regarded in art history, and it is thanks to Peggy's patronage that his career existed. Later in her life, Peggy was seen as an authority figure in the art world. She tells in her autobiography about Ceylon, an island where she lived for a short while as a break from Venice in 1954. Apparently, this community regarded her highly and asked for her advice about encouraging children in the arts. She says, "As Ceylon was such a small island, I was received with enthusiasm and written up in the papers as a great authority and asked to broadcast. I was even consulted by the wife of the chief of police, who begged me to tell her if her 12-year-old son should be encouraged to paint. His father very much disapproved of his artistic child's pursuits, which were fostered by the adoring mother. Actually, the child was an infant prodigy, and I had to admit it to the father, with the reservation that often children who begin painting well lose all their freshness when they grow up." Though not much is recorded about Peggy's thoughts on education, it can be observed from this interaction that her knowledge of art had grown to a point that she was confident in her abilities to recognize artistic talent in children. As one who appreciated abstract expressionism, it makes sense that Peggy would see value in the art of children. Within the progressive education movement, children were seen as artists with the desire to express themselves, and some self-expression educators, like Frank Cizik, claimed that child art had intrinsic value. Peggy's idea that children lose all their freshness when they grow up seems to flow right along with the expressionist philosophy. Efland explains, "Each educator of the non-interventionist teaching philosophy introduced by Cizik expressed the belief that the child is an artist with an innate desire for expression, and that this natural expression is thwarted by formal teaching methods more appropriate for adults." This progressive idea can be recognized in Peggy's thoughts about this child's pursuit of art. Although Peggy Guggenheim is not an art educator or directly connected to education, her work of bringing European art to America and supporting American artists was huge in altering the direction of the art world. Because of the shift to abstract expressionism that Peggy's work as a patron was a catalyst for, art education was affected with the new value placed on art as a way to express oneself. Victor D'Amico was a self-expressive educator who noticed the possible impact that modern art could have on art education. D'Amico believed that modern art would be the inspiration to nurture the development of self-expression. He believed that the goal of art education should be to help students work as an artist and experience the artistic process. In his text on the history of art education, Eflin describes the ways in which modern art affected art education. Innovations in art education after World War II included new projects inspired by modern artists. Eflin explains that art teachers began to introduce collage techniques inspired by the art of Braque and Picasso. Mobile projects that imitated Alexander Calder appeared in classrooms in the early 1950s. And these were artists that Peggy supported and featured in her galleries. Art teachers also began to include richer paints, clay, and paper sculptures. And not only was the variety of art media updated, but the modern era also brought new philosophical and ideological content. Artists were making art that responded to political and social movements, which in turn affected the content that art teachers decided to include for their students. Camille Cottrell describes the connection between the modern art movement and art education. She says, "The educational system of the United States became the most crucial prong in the collective which promoted modern art. Between 1930 and 1950, progressive educators advanced expressive pedagogical practices which advocated individual creativity and intellectual freedom. To the adherents of the expressive education philosophy, great art, great artists, and great educators had a profound responsibility to improve society through courageous innovation. The modern art aesthetic was embraced by progressive educators, for it was perceived as being inextricably bound to the hope of liberation and illumination through creative self-expression." It's clear from Cottrell's argument that the modern art movement and the progressive education movement would not have happened without each other. This goes to show the importance of Peggy's influence on education as well as education's influence on her. Peggy's legacy still exists today and is especially evident at the Palazzo Venier dei Leoni, Peggy's home in Venice, Italy, which now houses the Peggy Guggenheim collection. Her former home has become a museum that features many of the great works of American and European modern art that she collected during her lifetime. It was 1949 when Peggy purchased this home, and she created it to be a museum herself, even while she was still living there. Peggy worked hard with her maids to renovate the house to be set up as a gallery. She was able to install her collection of art by 1951, and that is when she opened the gallery to the public free of charge. She kept it open until her death in 1979. Peggy left her palazzo and collection to the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation, which was established by her uncle and also supports the Guggenheim Museum in New York. So, in 1980, the Peggy Guggenheim collection opened as a museum in her honor under its new management. This museum is an outward representation of Peggy's legacy, but the difference she made in art history is far more expansive than what art educators today realize. Without her work of collecting and supporting modern artists, the art movements in America would have been vastly different. The conversations she hosted between European and American modern artists made an incredible impact on the direction of surrealism and abstract expressionism. These art movements, in turn, have changed the way art educators approach their pedagogy, and these effects can still be observed in classrooms today. May art educators not forget the impact of Peggy Guggenheim. Her love for art and her work as a collector and patron have allowed art education to be what it is in America today.